Thank you very much, and I apologize for being unable to attend this fantastically interesting conference. I was looking forward to this, but I had a higher ethical obligation, I'm sure, and many of you will understand, to be present for a student's doctoral examination, pre-dissertation exam, which got postponed one time, so I was there. Thank you again. Well, being moved to this place on the schedule, thanks to Steve's generosity, I wanted to provide perhaps something of a larger perspective, although certainly some of the things that Gert-Jan mentioned echoed in my mind as an editor, and the notion that this is a continuing process, and that it's really, its validity and success is measured as a process, not necessarily by easily definable goals or endpoints, is a continuing challenge for all of us. So by stepping back, I began to think, what is really underlying the importance of discussions such as this on the ethical aspects of publication and even the means of publication and dissemination, the international scope, and some of the articles in the small academic executive newsletter. To me, it really falls into this notion of what I've termed preserving the scientific commons. And this phrase, for those of you who don't know, comes from ecology. Garrett Hardin, who is one of the founders of modern ecologic sciences, wrote a very important article in Science magazine perhaps 40 years ago called The Tragedy of the Commons. And what he was referring to was in terms of preserving natural goods and resources, but he expounded a general principle, which is that any good, any valued object that is held in common encourages exploitation, so that if there is no clear ownership or regulation with a small r, then all users see no particular obstacle to using the resource to its full extent, and therefore will do so. And his example was the exploitation of common grazing lands in England, which became overgrazed because nobody was really regulating the share of the resource. And what he pointed out, and I think resonates with some of my experiences certainly of publishing and editing and reviewing and scientific publication, is that the only way we really get a responsible sharing of any common good is by adopting a community ethic. That we all agree that this is a good that we want to preserve for everyone, which means that none of us, perhaps, will use it to the optimal extent that we might personally want or feel that we need or deserve. So to that extent, the community enforces the ethic of preserving the common. And I think we do this in science. Really, we have done this traditionally in science, and I'm going to argue that that scientific publication and scientific knowledge is our commons. And we've created a community, essentially, over the past 600 years of modern science, partly by the way we train scientists, which is really a very ancient method of inculcating not only knowledge and practice, but also ethical values through a kind of guild system whereby people apprentice themselves to scientists within the community. And we have our ways of bestowing rewards and punishments. Although, as Hardin points out, that's not as effective as getting a common ethic adopted by the community. And I think we see that in our own perplexities with some of the issues we've all encountered. So as I said, I use this image because I began to think that the scientific commons for us is shared knowledge. And it was nice to see the responses that Gert-Jan showed, which showed the high priority placed upon this as a value in terms of publishing. And it's therefore the community of scientists, but even more in the late 20th and 21st century, this community includes people who benefit from the production of knowledge. And this may be from a commercial point of view, it may be from a national interest point of view, it may be for waging more effective warfare, it may be for selling products it's larger than it used to be. And that's one of the challenges I think that we need to think about. Not only is it internationalized, which has raised some issues, but our community now, that is the people who have a stake in the commons, is considerably wider than scientists themselves. And so you bring now to bear very different kinds of ethics and practices, values, rewards, and punishment systems, some of which come into conflict with each other. And I think we're seeing some of that. So we have always assumed that the responsibility for scientific knowledge, which I'm calling our commons, relies with the scientific community, that we should be primarily policing ourselves. And I think a new version of this came about towards the end of the 20th century, which was the notion that science will eventually self-correct itself. So if there are problems, if there are errors, if there's plagiarism, if there's falsification, eventually this will come out. And I think we comfort ourselves with that notion that we really don't have to exert an effort to define an ethic that protects scientific information through the medium of publication in any form, because eventually it will be okay. And certainly that was one of the drivers that people would cite when they talked about totally open source publishing, or even publishing without any peer review, just throw it up and see what sticks on the wall, and the stuff that's no good will eventually fall off the wall. Now, of course, a lot of harm can be done while false information is still sticking on the wall. I would say, for example, it underlies the idea of Wikipedia that allow the community, and now the community is anybody who can go to Wikipedia, to generate a knowledge base, and it will be corrected by the community. I don't know about you, but I spend about one day a month going through Wikipedia articles that are about me and correcting them. I go back the next month and there's some new and interesting, fanciful information. So I am perhaps jaundiced on this idea of the wiki notion of correcting things. And then of course we now have this problem that the dimensionality of knowledge has become enormous. It is not confined to printing things. It is not confined to libraries. You know, it used to be you would know, quote, what was correct by going to a library or to an encyclopedia. There is no defined imprimatur which shows the way. Maybe there is, but there's so many other sources of information out there, many of which are very beautifully crafted. So that it's very, very difficult to steer people through the broad bounds of what is now the scientific commons, or what can present itself as part of the scientific commons. I think we also have several types of threats which play out in the area of publication as well. One is, as many people have discussed, is the expansion of the scientific community. I've already alluded to that. It's now not just a small cult in which we bring along the acolytes and we form them in the tradition and the practices of our ethos. It's global, it's multicultural, it involves many different media, many different stakeholders, and many different interests. I would also say that I think one of the threats has been the whole rise of bibliometrics, particularly as it relates to academic and professional advancement, which in many ways starts to generate bad practices in order to obtain good metrics. And I think you just alluded to some in terms of perhaps attempting to manipulate impact factors, and certainly over-publishing and possible duplication and falsification. I think this is one of the drivers, and I would say this has arisen within the academic and professional communities. And then I really would like to point out that some of the attempts we've made to deal with issues of ethical violations in terms of the production of science, such as the fraud and abuse investigations, which have been institutionalized within the National Institutes of Health, in my experience, have really resulted in some very distressing misuses. And I'd only like to cite one case, which you may not know of, but it involved one of the most distinguished researchers in environmental health, Dr. Herbert Needleman, who was at Harvard and then at the University of Pittsburgh. And his research on the effects of lead on young children was very, very influential, not only scientifically, certainly in the medical profession, but also in terms of public policy. as to what to do about lead in the environment and its notable sources. Now, some of the sources of lead in the environment at the time were not particularly pleased to have a bright light shone on the effects of lead in the environment on the health of children. And they actually instituted a suit which was brought by an academic consultant to the lead industry. They filed a complaint with the NIH Office of Scientific Integrity, alleging that Needleman had committed scientific fraud. This was a very, very deeply and personally destructive event for Herbert Needleman to live through. I think academic institutions were not well prepared to handle these allegations when NIH made the referral back to the academic institution. And so sometimes the methods that we have adopted to counteract what we perceive as threats, and certainly there is fraud and abuse, have turned out in themselves, I think, to generate some difficult problems. And this goes to the point that Hardin made that I cited at the beginning. Preserving the commons works best by a shared ethos, not by instituting rewards and punishments. And of course, we do have examples. There's a reason why these systems get set up, because we do certainly have examples of individual and institutional malfeasance, which come from within our community. There are also, I'd like to point some external problems that we have to deal with as we attempt to preserve the commons and assist this preservation through the 21st century. One is, I think, really is the problems of success of science. You know, we have a great number of policy decisions that are made, for example, in environmental and occupational regulation, in the provision of health programs to the public at large, et cetera, that are based on science. So this enlarges the stakeholders. Now people are concerned about science who are not themselves scientists, but as in the instance of the Needleman case, may be very concerned about the impact of a decision that is based on science. So in fact, this raises the stakes in terms of who's involved in the discourse about the integrity and quality of science, and as well as the methods that some stakeholders might use. The other success, I think, is really the rise of evidence-based medicine, as exemplified by the Cochrane collaboration, and certainly driven, as those of you who know about Cochrane, and I know many people here at Maryland do, as well as my colleague, Dr. Dickerson, who's now at Hopkins with me, that the notion was that in order to provide fair and effective medical care through the national purse, rather than as private transactions, there was a need to really understand what was effective in medical practice and to develop methodologies that would in fact guarantee that. And as you know, this has generated a whole field of knowledge production within the Cochrane collaboration, and then emulations of the principles of systematic review that have influenced a wide variety of practices throughout the life sciences, certainly, at least, and to some extent, interestingly, some of you may know, that a variety of social scientists and economists are trying to apply these same principles for understanding the impacts of social policy or development policy. So this extends science, and therefore the community of persons who are concerned about science, very much beyond the original community and participants in the community. And the uses of science now are much more influential, far beyond the range of a discourse about knowledge. It becomes now a discourse about policy and about politics. As a result, we have the intervention of interested parties, which I've already indicated by the story of Needleman. But some of you may also be aware that there's been extensive discourse involving litigation and other activities around research on tobacco. For example, Dr. Glanz at the University of California, San Francisco, who did some of the first research on secondhand smoke effects, had all his research sued for under litigation by the tobacco industry, and he was not able really to protect all of his material. In addition, we are still living through fallout and continuing controversies that involve a broad range of stakeholders in terms of climate science. So the whole issue of protecting the commons, the users of this scientific information is, I think, much more complex. And to that extent, the position of any group, such as scientific editors, publishers, librarians, and all of us in this room, has much higher priority beyond the realm of science, and is much more complicated because there are many different factors at play here. And then I think there are some social events that have challenged us as well, and that is what the social scientists refer to as the de-privileging of science. I may be the only person in this room who is actually enrolled in a history of science program, and I can tell you a great deal of that message is, you people think you're so smart, but you really don't know anything more than the rest of us. And so the kind of deference that was given to scientific information has been challenged, and some of that may have been long overdue. But it does also change the nature of the discussion. It's not really, is this being accurately presented, but what gives you the right to say this is what happens anyway? And then I would have to say, certainly in this country, that the growing scientific illiteracy is a tremendous challenge, I think, to improving the integrity of the scientific commons, as well as the interest of the public in really ensuring that the scientific commons is preserved for the good of all. So at the same time as we have an expansion of the influence and value of scientific knowledge, we also have a pushback from some academics in terms of whether this is really knowledge that's any better than any other form of knowledge, and also from the public that thinks all of this is just nonsense anyway, and why is it better than Genesis? So we have some serious challenges. Sorry if I offended anybody. Okay. So I think as we look at this picture, we have to say, what can we use as people involved in the production, the dissemination, and the custodianship of scientific information and the commons? What can we use really to assist us? I think the first and foremost issue is transparency. Now, that's to some extent a packed word. Transparency goes to really making explicit many of the issues that Gerd-Jan laid out, so that this is the public, that authors, scientists, and others are really aware of what this all means and how we interpret it. I don't know how many of you are aware that actually the Supreme Court of the United States has issued a definition of what peer review is. This is in a decision called Daubert, and I think you might want to read it, because I think it will make your hair stand on end as to what the courts think peer review is all about. So we need to be more transparent about what we're about, and we need to communicate, I think, in a better way what we mean by all these terms. I mean, when we say, well, this paper is duplicative, but then on the other hand, the Cochrane collaboration would tell us we want to have replicated studies, don't we, upon which to base calls of causality. That is sort of inherently duplicative. So we have to be careful about some of our definitions in terms of the way that science has evolved in service to other social goals, such as biomedical practice. Accessibility, I think, is an issue that's very contested in science. I mentioned in the case involving Needleman and Glanz that the industry actually sued to get the raw data. Now, I think most scientists, frankly, would be quite hesitant about including access to raw data as part of accessibility. There are journals in which reviewers are permitted to request a certain amount of raw data, for example, to examine the biostatistical modeling that was done in support of the study results and discussion. There's a potential line at some point there which has not been well defined by our community. And once again, I'd stress, if we don't do these definitions, other people, like the Supreme Court, will go and define them for us. And so we need to be aware, and maybe with a little bit of foresight, anticipate the directions and uses and interests in the scientific commons of information and knowledge. I'm involved right now in a discussion with some members of the Cochrane collaboration in which they're quite interested in obtaining greater access to the data behind clinical trials a very contested area of biomedical research involving interests, parties of interest, stakeholders, etc. How far can that possibly go? They're interested in the ability to actually take the raw data to undertake a meta-analysis rather than taking the published data and performing a meta-analytic combination of those data. There's clearly going to be some line there that will be very difficult to figure out, particularly since people can get access to data for good reasons. This is obviously a subjective concept. I think it's a good reason, or for bad reasons. I think the lead industry was using it for bad reasons, but that's a perspective outside what we're trying to define as the ethos here. Responsibility is extremely important. I think that many of the issues that were discussed in the last talk, certainly I feel as an editor, I know it's very true that that scale that was shown in terms of what the journal should do, and then or peer review, which after all is managed by the editor, supported by publishers, but really the responsibility is with me. I would say I certainly hope that I can pick up some of the ethical problems in papers. Do I do it? Probably not that well, and the gap may be just about exactly what was shown on that graph, frankly. And I'm not sure how we can improve it, and it remains an issue of concern to me and to Ms. Jackson, who's my managing editor, sitting there as well. Responsibility, of course, I think is one of those key aspects of the ethos that we need to remind all practitioners that ultimately the ethical failures in the scientific commons are the result, in many cases, of our own actions. And I would extend that even to institutions when they fail to offer appropriate protection to scientific researchers within the institution. And I think fundamentally, as we deal now in a kind of multi-culti world of science, which is of course very exciting, you know, we've built up this ethos essentially from what? Roger Bacon onward, modern science. You know, it's 500, 600 years of thinking within very small corners of Western Europe. And it, of course, partook of an underlying ethos that had been developed within those societies as well. We are now hoping and eagerly anticipating a much more globalized community of contributors to the scientific commons, and how do we extend and even incorporate perhaps modifications of what we assume is the appropriate ethos to protect the community, at the same time as welcoming in these additional communities to extending and expanding the scientific commons as well as preserving it. I do not think that more rules and regulations will be the answer to the problems. I do not think instituting kind of automatic punishments that may fall with specific infractions. First off, that will require us to be much more transparent in our definitions of what infractions are, and I've already mentioned that I think we have problems in that regard, although others are doing it. But some way in which we can formulate a path forward in a very different world with very different media, very different opportunities for dissemination and building the commons is probably our hope in terms of protecting the scientific commons and ensuring an ethical practice in the dissemination of knowledge. So thank you very much.